You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Phineas Rueckert, an investigative journalist based in Paris. Given his work, he's perfectly positioned to explore a set of French-English homophones that mean entirely different things. Evidence and évidence. I am so excited to welcome Phineas Rueckert to the podcast today. Phineas, thank you so much for joining me. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. It's really fun to be on this podcast. A little bit about myself. I'm a journalist based in Paris. I work at a journalism nonprofit called Forbidden Stories. And essentially what we do is pursue the work of threatened reporters around the world. So when journalists are killed, put in prison, when there's a case of an enforced disappearance, and a journalist was working on a certain topic, that's often a very sensitive topic, what we try to do is bring together international reporters to pursue that work and to publish that work together.
Wow.
So I'm a reporter at Forbidden Stories. We're a group of international journalists whose mission is to pursue the work of threatened colleagues. And I started here about 3 years ago. What actually took me to Paris is a master's program at Sciences Po, where I did a joint master in journalism and international affairs. And I actually have a very long and sort of winding history with France, background with family history with France. My parents were both Americans, met here in the 70s. They did the Champagne Vendange together, and they ended up living in France for a few years in their mid-20s. And so my mom, who's a teacher, she used to teach a class when I was a kid for the City University of New York. She would teach a literature class in Paris every summer. So basically from the age of 3, I've been coming to Paris. Through that, I sort of got the bug, I guess, that runs in the family of loving France and loving Paris and wanting to live here. And so, yeah, I ended up coming for grad school, and then I stayed to work at Forbidden Stories. And I also, on the side, do a lot of freelance reporting. I've written a number of essays and articles for Jacobin magazine, for New Lines magazine, Next City, which is a blog about urban affairs. I'm currently working on a piece for The Nation. So yeah, there's lots of things to look at and investigate in Paris.
And you're going to have to forgive me, and anybody who doesn't like puns who's listening to the podcast is going to have to forgive me, because as I was listening to your story of how you kind of made it to France, I realized that there are actually 2 reasons now that I want to talk to you about the word that I've brought you onto the podcast to talk about, which is évident or évidence, because it seems to me that it was almost an évidence that you would end up in Paris, given your background, but you also spend your life pursuing evidence. And that is sort of the word that I wanted to have you come on and talk about, which is évident. So you've been here a while. You have this long, long history in France. You have a career that leads you to pursue trails and evidence. How do you see or understand the link between the way that the French use the word évident or évidence and the way that we in English use the word evidence? Are they related? Are they different? Sort of what's your gut reaction to that relationship?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked me to talk about this subject, because I love the French expression, actually, c'est pas évident, which is, I think, something we'll talk about down the line. But essentially, I mean, to me, évident is something that's innate, something that's very clear to the eye, whereas evidence, like in the American sense, is proof often of something hidden, something that's not immediately visible and that you need to go and find. So yeah, when I was thinking through the differences between these 2 conceptions of words, I think the French use évident in a different way than we do, which I think if you say something is evident in English, it sort of means it's super obvious. Whereas in French, if you use the word évident, it means that it's clear to a French person. It's clear to someone who knows the system. So I think that's sort of a big difference. And so when you're often, filing paperwork or going to get your visa renewed, and you often find yourself a square peg in a round hole, often the French will respond to you, c'est pas évident. It's not clear how to do this because you don't fit into the right sort of boxes. So yeah, I think that's for me sort of the difference between the two conceptions of the word.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that way that they wield it in that expression, c'est pas évident, like you hear French people a lot of the time making statements about what something isn't. French people will say like, oh, c'est pas mal, it's not bad. Or like if you ask someone like, hey, do you want to like go to the bar with me on Saturday? They'll be like, pourquoi pas? Why not? Like you often get this sort of statements in the negative to express something positive almost in French. Is that something that you've sort of noticed insofar as when you were talking about c'est pas évident?
Yeah, definitely. So I think maybe like the for me, the most classic example of that would be either c'est pas faux, it's not false, or c'est pas ouf, which I guess that might be too much explaining, but like c'est pas ouf, it's like it's not great.
Oh, we can definitely break that one down because that's a really fun one. So ouf is verlan for fou, so crazy.
Exactly. If something is not ouf, it's not crazy, so it's not good. Just kind of on the same track of that, there's c'est pas mal. You mentioned c'est pas mal, but then there's also c'est vraiment pas mal. It's very not bad, which means it's good. Whereas c'est pas mal is like, it's solid, it's okay, it's pretty good. But then there's c'est vraiment pas mal, which is just, I love that French conception of something that's very not bad is good, as opposed to just saying it's good.
Right. So we're basically talking we're negating things so that we don't have to actually be positive in French.
Yeah, I think, and it is sort of a cultural thing where, I mean, I think for a lot of Americans who first moved to France, you're just kind of shocked by how great everything is, how, you immediately have healthcare, how there's sort of this culture of, intellectual rigor and debate that is very strong. You have amazing access to natural beauty, to, in one country, there's so many different topographies. It's just such an incredible country. And then you get here and the people are just like, c'est pas mal, it's not bad. And you're just like, how are you not seeing the evidence of the country that you live in and the positive sort of elements of it? That I think it's because you grow up and you take it for granted. And of course, there's lots of problems in France that we could discuss that are less shimmering once you've lived here for a while. But when you first get here, you're just, I at least was kind of shocked by how blasé people generally are about things. And I think that's just a French, it's not necessarily like that they're negative people. It's maybe that Americans are necessarily incredibly positive, which is good and bad. But I think it's definitely jarring when you first move to France. I don't know if you experienced that too.
Oh, 100%. And actually, now we're getting way off topic, but that's part of the fun of this podcast. I wrote a story about like why the French love complaining so much and the fact that they have like 3 different words for complaining in different contexts. And the fact that like râler is complaining, but they actually really love it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a national sport.
Yeah, totally. Well, okay. So you said something about évident that I think is so interesting and I want to linger over it because I think we didn't talk about it nearly enough when you brought it up. Because you said when French people say c'est pas évident, you said that there's something about understanding évidence within the context of being French, like being obvious to a French person specifically. So I think when you were talking about c'est pas évident, and we talk about that as being something that is not easy or not simple, that might be complicated, the official Académie Française dictionary calls people out for using that expression. And they say that using c'est pas évident to mean it's not easy is incorrect, and that people should say ce n'est pas facile, which means it's not easy. So first of all, what's the difference in a French mind of like c'est pas évident and c'est pas facile? And how French does your brain have to be for you to understand something that is évident to French people?
So my first reaction was, I don't think I've ever heard or very rarely heard a French person say c'est pas facile. Like that's kind of it doesn't seem very French to me. Like maybe I was thinking maybe someone might say c'est pas simple. It's not simple. So I think to me at least like facile would be more like simple. Like it's kind of like blindingly obvious, something that's facile. Whereas évident, again, like I think it takes a little more digging to an outsider to understand something évident. Whereas to them, again, to the French, it's évident. So, in kind of looking up, researching for this podcast, I actually wanted to look up like what is the definition of évident according to the French. So I looked it up in the Larousse dictionary, and they define it as qui est d'une certitude absolue et s'impose à l'esprit. So something that is of absolute certainty and imposes itself on your spirit, which, first of all, is just like the most French definition of anything ever.
Oh my God.
What does it mean to have something imposed on your spirit? But I actually do think that it kind of does tell something about the way the French operate. Okay, so impose on your spirit, I started thinking, what does that actually mean? I think it's sort of like through this sort of French education system, through sort of the culture of debate that permeates this country, you sort of do have certain sort of axiomatic truths, égalité, liberté, fraternité, for example, that are sort of imposed on you. And like, if you don't accept them, that's a problem. And that's like part of the reason why there's a lot of difficulties, why the French, or some certain segments of the French, have a lot of difficulty with integrating immigrant populations, for example, because they don't necessarily fulfill that évidence. So I think, there's sort of this, like, I don't want to call it totalitarian, but there's like this intellectual environment and academic system in France that does sort of like internalize certain things. And that can be like big level things like, values and cultural sort of touchstones. But it can also be like littler things, just, movie references and books that everybody's read and philosophers that everybody knows. So I think, the thing about that évident is imposing itself on you is something that sort of happens when you move to France. That's also one way to integrate it, to like make it so that for you, those things also become évident.
And so I think that definition kind of reinforces the reason why I wanted to ask you another question about évident and kind of the French relationship towards the truth and towards like data and facts, because we think about the French, at least I do, having, done some schooling here, they have like a very Cartesian logic, like a very scientific way of even approaching the humanities. And yet I sometimes feel as though their relationship towards like the truth as an objective thing, it's kind of, objective truths don't always sit that well with the French. Like sometimes they like a story more than they like the facts. So I'm sort of curious, in your work as a journalist, have you found that the French are like more sensitive to what we in English would call evidence or facts or, data than Americans? Or is the opposite true? Like, are facts and evidence more useful in convincing a French person of a certain perspective or a certain reality, or maybe more useful in convincing Americans of a certain perspective or a certain reality?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. For me, it's not necessarily a question of whether the French accept or don't accept facts more than the Americans do. What I think it's more about is what it is more about for the French is how you present the facts and like the logical reasoning you use to make an argument. I think like there's a very sort of almost formulaic way that the French think about like truth creation. And that comes from, again, like it comes from like a very specific way you're taught to reason in school. Like you have the point, the counterpoint. There's like 3 examples. Like it's very formulaic. And I think if you present sort of your evidence, your facts, your documents, whatever it is, in that sort of same way, I think they're very receptive to that. I think where the French struggle is sort of like a chaotic, if you sort of throw facts out chaotically. Whereas I think a lot of debate in the US is just like people arguing over statistics and like whether a statistic is real or not. But I think maybe in France, it's more putting the statistic in context and explaining it in a way that makes sense with the French logical reasoning, which also I think for me is what sort of explains the very different style of journalism that exists in this country.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
In US Anglophone journalism, you think of an inverted triangle, right? Where there's the most important information is all at the top. In France, they flipped that on its head. They put all the most important information at the bottom, and they kind of walk you through from a very broad sort of idea. They walk you through to what they want you to believe. And I think that maybe for me is the biggest difference. It's not necessarily the facts themselves, it's the way they're presented.
That is so fascinating. And it definitely resonates with me as someone who's done a bit of, higher level academics in France, where when I wrote my first draft of my master's thesis, my thesis advisor was like, well, this is very nice, but it's built backwards. And, I had gone to American high school and I had learned how to present my thesis statement in the introduction and then back it up. And in France, you're supposed to write a hypothesis, like a question, and then answer the question over the course of the paper. And the conclusion has your thesis statement in it.
Yeah, I mean, they're very trusting in their reader that the reader is going to read all the way to the end. And I think maybe that's probably, changing with the ways in which our attention spans themselves are changing. Maybe even the French will eventually start writing their journalistic pieces or their academic pieces in a more American way because they'll worry that they'll lose their readers midway. But like, for example, one thing that you see often in Anglophone news outlets that you would, I've never seen it, at least in a French news article, is you'll have at the top of an article sort of like, here are the 3 to 5 points you need to remember. And it's like it's like a bullet point list. Like that, I don't think the French would ever do, because it just goes too much against their sort of like, you have to carry the reader along with you, as you build evidence of the point that you're eventually going to make. Whereas the Americans were like, this is the thing that you need to believe. Okay, now I'm going to prove it to you.
So when you're doing this work, this investigative work, are you finding that you often come face to face with bureaucrats or gatekeepers of any kind in France who will say to you, either in so many words or in, a different sort of way, c'est pas évident, that what you're asking them is not necessarily simple? And is built into that sort of reaction, is there a promise that they're still going to try? Or is that just a gentle way of them saying, no, it's not possible and I won't be doing anything for you?
It's interesting. I think there's a lot more gray areas in France, in French culture and in French academic institutions, in just the French way of thinking about the world. And I think oftentimes I'll go into a story thinking, basically, here's my story and here's what people are going to say. Like you can kind of almost, when you've done enough interviews as a journalist, you can almost predict what the interviewee is going to say. Whereas when you talk, especially to like French academics, they'll counter you on things. They'll say, actually, it's not that simple. And even, recently I was doing an interview for a piece that should be coming out soon about the rise of far-right violence in France. And I was speaking to an academic and I was like, could you say, and I was asking this question because I had read that this was the case. I asked him, could you say that there's an unprecedented rise in far-right violence in France right now? And of course, he didn't want to say that. He wanted to go back all the way like to the 1980s and explain, the different types of violence against migrants and other types of vulnerable populations back then, before sort of getting around to my question and saying it's not necessarily that there's an inherent unprecedented rise in violence, but there's an inherent unprecedented rise in the possibility of violence. So, it's a lot more subtle. And I think maybe some academics, and I don't want to say all American academics, probably a lot of American academics would also push back on that and contextualize. But, in some cases, maybe they're just kind of go along with the narrative that you're kind of serving up to them on a plate. Whereas, like, at least in this most recent interview, he didn't want to necessarily give me that sort of basic point that I was starting the questioning from. I don't know if that was your question. That was kind of a long-winded answer.
No, but I think you did answer it in perhaps a particularly French way, because I think that Americans, I almost feel as though we've been trained to speak in sound bites. Like I noticed that a lot in my journalism work, which is in a very different field from yours. I write about cake, so it's different. But when I'm interviewing chefs and culinary professionals in America, I feel as though they're really good at speaking in sound bites and in distilling their story down into a handful of sentences, because I think that we as Americans have The way our evening news shows that we all grew up with are formatted. We want things to be quick. We want to understand what's happening from the outset. And maybe we're a little less trusting of the storyteller that they're going to take us somewhere interesting. Whereas maybe in France, there's an understanding that if there's a person telling you a story and they are a storyteller, that you just have to trust that they're going to get somewhere interesting and insightful eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think one thing I sort of would worry about just with sort of, I don't know, I'm going to sound like an old person here, but like the rise of social media, the sort of polarization of society that we've seen in the US for the past 10, 15 years, I think that's starting to happen more in France. And so there is more of this sort of Manichaean, black and white, truth and not truth, good guys and bad guys sort of rhetoric that's starting to pop up on French talk shows. Just, thinking of like Cyril Hanouna, the Mon Post talk show host, who's constantly creating these sort of dichotomies. And I think that's sort of imported from the US. And certainly, I think lots of Americans living in France, like in certain ways, fled that world. And now to start to see it again is a bit concerning.
So these days, you living in France and knowing what you know about this phrase, c'est pas évident, when someone says that to you, whether in your work life or in your private life, what's your sort of knee-jerk reaction?
So I actually think oftentimes the c'est pas évident is kind of, it's like they're like softening the blow. And like you can kind of tell when someone says to you, c'est pas évident, like they feel for you, because it probably means that you're not fitting into some sort of like pre-established situation or box or what have you. So whenever I think if someone says c'est pas évident, I don't let it discourage me either, because I think another very French thing is sort of like starting from a point of impossibility and then getting to a point of possibility. So like the number of times I've heard, and this is probably another conversation you've probably already had in this show, but c'est pas possible, it's not possible. You often are able to kind of get from c'est pas possible to like, okay, well, maybe if we do exactly this in this way, there's a chance that we could get this to happen. Whereas I think in the US, you start with like, oh, of course, it's easy, not a problem. And then, in the end, it's actually much more complicated than you think. So I actually think that I kind of do appreciate it when I'm told c'est pas évident, because at least there's an admission that it's less clear than it should be. And it's going to be more complicated than it should be. But I think also sort of when someone tells you c'est pas évident, you have someone like on your side who's going to help you figure out the situation and sort of walk you through it.
Yeah, I love that. And that actually really does answer quite well. Anybody who's tuning in for the first time, we have an episode with Sylvia Sabes who talks about the French relationship with the word no. And I think, we delve a little bit into that, but I mean, that really does complete the sort of conversation that we had about how often no is just, the beginning of a conversation, whereas in English, no is kind of closing the door.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is written about in, I'm forgetting the name of the book off the top of my head, but it's two Canadian researchers.
60 Million Frenchmen Couldn't Be Wrong, or that one?
They wrote that book, but they also wrote another book, which is basically, about, navigating.
The Bonjour Effect.
The Bonjour Effect.
So Julie Barlow, who wrote that book, again, I'm calling out former episodes, was in the pilot episode of this very show talking about bonjour. So definitely recommend reading that book for anybody who's interested in continuing their explorations of the ins and outs of French culture.
There we go. Unintentional product placement.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that here. Well, thank you so very much for joining me today. This has been fascinating. I hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss other words down the line. For anyone who has been listening who wants to read a bit more of your work, should they follow you on Twitter? Should they subscribe to a newsletter? Where can people find you?
Sure. Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter. It's at Phineas, JFR. And they could also, if they want to check out the work that I've done for Forbidden Stories, they can go to forbiddenstories.org, where we have all of our most recent investigations.
Perfect. We will throw links to both of those in the show notes for the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for joining me, Phineas. I only have one last question for you before I let you go, which is, what is your favorite word in French?
So I have to admit, I have sources who have warned me that this could be a question asked on this podcast. I also could have just done my research and listened to the other podcasts that you've done, which I will now do because it sounds very fun. But to get to your question, so the word that I would choose is a fun one. And I also just recently looked up the definition and where it comes from. It's a rocambolesque.
Oh, wow.
Which essentially means like wild and sort of like unexpected and improbable. And it actually comes from like a 19th century book called Les Exploits de Rocambole. I have not read the book, but I guess he gets into some sort of crazy adventures that are twisting and turning. And I think that word is just in itself rocambolesque.
I like that, and I feel like it is an excellent replacement for what used to be one of my favorite words, but I feel like is now overused, which is Kafkaesque. So I'm going to start using, say it again, rocambolesque?
Rocambolesque.
Rocambolesque. I'm going to start using that instead and feel very highbrow.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and have an excellent rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.